Hi, how are you doing? Thank you for joining me today. So, when you have an issue that reasonable and well meaning people strongly disagree about, the truth is almost certainly somewhere in the gap between the two sides. And that gap that divides them, that's where you find truth. Extreme positions are almost never right, and finding the truth usually requires finding a balance between those really extreme perspectives. Uh, And when you talk about disagreement between rational and well meaning people, it often arises from each side clinging to part of the truth with the assumption that they have the whole truth. And when you consider the truths that each side holds to and allows, and really consider the value of each side's arguments, you can get a fuller picture of the issue and find a more balanced perspective that takes what I would believe is more accurate and more valuable. Because if reasonable people and well meaning people believe something, there must be some valid reason for them to do so. And if we ignore those valid reasons to embrace the other extreme, we aren't taking into consideration all the facts on that issue. Jesus calls us to walk a narrow path, and it ultimately doesn't matter if we stray to the left or the right, we're still off the path. And I came to this realization during my days of wrestling with the big theological debates when I was at seminary. But I've come to realize that this really applies to just about every issue. And there was one issue, however, that for many years I couldn't see how there could be any balanced position: abortion. I mean, how could there be any room to compromise on whether or not murdering innocent babies was okay? Or so I thought. In my past two videos, I've pointed out that I came to a series of realizations and discoveries that caused me to view the anti abortion position that I held to so strongly always. And I realized it was rooted in a lot of false assumptions and I started searching for a better answer and better understanding the issue. And initially, I was just trying to develop a stronger anti abortion argument that didn't rely on faulty and inaccurate premises. But it evolved into something else. I realized that I was wrong, that liberals didn't have some insatiable lust for the unborn's blood. They were really motivated by a desire to preserve the personal freedoms of individuals, and the loss of those freedoms literally leads to life and death consequences for women. But I knew many of the anti abortion advocates were really motivated not by just a desire to control women, as they're often accused, but they really start with a well intentioned desire to protect what they view as innocent life. Now, you can say, well, they're inconsistent in their defense of innocent life. That might be a valid criticism, but I do believe that really is the driving force for many people on the pro life issue. Question is can we find truth in the massive gap between these two sides? I believe that we can, but to find it, we have to think rationally rather than let our passions rule over us. This is a view position and an issue where a lot of passions get flared up, and politicians tried to pose this as a simple black and white issue because our emotions can only think in very simplistic terms. And the politicians want us to keep acting out of emotions so they can manipulate us for their own power. The reality is that abortion isn't a simple issue at all. It's really a complex problem that requires a complex solution that we will never find so long as we let our emotions and passions do the thinking for us. So today I want to take a look at this issue rationally. I want to explain the balanced perspective that I've come to hold. Now I'm going to say right now that I don't consider my position to be the final answer on this complex problem. I'm not going to say that I've, in my infinite wisdom, been able to solve this problem that's divided so many for so long. But I want to present you what I've come to believe on this issue, so that you can appreciate the complexity of the issue, for one, and hopefully inspire you to think more deeply on the issue to come to your own conclusions. I want to make it clear also that I am examining this issue from the perspective of a Christian theologian. I'm not a expert on the U.S. Constitution. I'm not trying to approach this as a legal matter. I'm focusing on what is morally right from a Christian perspective. That's not to say that, and that's not the same as what should be legal. There are some overlaps, but and I will briefly address those as we come to the end. But there's a difference between what I think is right and what I think should be legal and not legal. As a Christian, my beliefs will inevitably influence my my political and legal perspective on issues. But I want to clarify that I believe right off the bat. I want to say, I believe in the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, and I believe that the law, that church and state should stay separated. I think that's necessary to protect everybody's religious freedoms, even the religious freedoms of Christians. So I don't believe that any law should be based because the Bible tells me so. I will govern my own life by the Bible, but I don't believe that we can govern other people's lives according to it. And if we can't make a case for a law without appealing to Scripture, I don't think that should be a law. So that's a premise that I'm going to be, just want to let you know that I start off with from the beginning. But again, today I'm focusing on, as a Christian, what is right from a Christian perspective. So as we're delving into this deep issue, I think we really need to define what the issue is. In the Roe versus Wade decision, the Supreme Court defines abortion as an issue of conflict between the right to privacy, the right to make personal choices, and the right to life for the unborn. In the Roe decision, SCOTUS recognized that the right to privacy isn't absolute, however. We don't have an absolute right. And we don't have the right to make any private decisions if those private decisions harm another person. For Christians, we should be willing to forego our rights for the welfare of others, especially. Paul makes this point especially clear, especially in 1 Corinthians 9. So when we insist on our rights over the welfare of another, it's selfish, it's direct opposition to loving our neighbor as ourselves, as well as taking up the cross to follow Jesus. So from a Christian perspective, this whole idea of I've got my rights and nobody's going to tread on my rights, we can come into some serious problems on that. Our rights aren't absolute, and we should be willing to sacrifice what is our rights and and what's good for us in order to save and serve others. Now, when evangelicals do respond to the pro-choice arguments, they appeal to the life of the unborn, taking priority over the concern for the right to privacy. They'll even argue at times that in cases of rape and incest, the argument that they make is that the crime committed against the woman, which is a horrible crime committed a woman, but it doesn't justify committing another crime by murdering the innocent child that resulted in the first crime. Now, I know that's a harsh statement and everything, but that's the position that they are, but it does seem very unloving. But we do have to ask, like, at what point does taking an innocent life justify it? Do two wrongs make a right? But the problem with all the anti-abortion arguments is that they all assume that the unborn is a person. If the unborn isn't a human person, their arguments lose all their teeth. So the real issue at the heart of the abortion debate isn't whether how do we balance the right to privacy with the right of the life of the unborn. The real issue is, when does the unborn become a person? Now, I grew up hearing this question being reduced to really a binary choice. Either life begins at conception or it begins at birth. And this raises the question then, how does passing through a birth canal grant you personhood? How does just a change of location affect a baby's ontological value? And since it's hard to deny that a 9-month-old fetus is a human baby, then the anti-abortion argument, points that once we grant that the unborn is living, they say, okay, personhood begins at conception. There are a lot of problems with this reasoning, however. And reality is that few are going to debate that personhood of the unborn is a real thing for a third trimester fetus. The two major court cases defining a woman's right to choose, Roe v. Wade and the Casey decision, agree on this. They actually prohibit third trimester abortion, or they did until they were overturned. They prohibited third trimester abortions nationwide, except when it was medically necessary. For as I mentioned in my first video, this renders the arguments about late-term abortions really moot and honestly deceptive. But again, I already discussed that in a previous video in this series. And there are a few people with having theological and philosophical reasons to advocate that personhood doesn't begin until birth. Most people, however, do accept that the unborn is a person by the third trimester, at which point they are viable outside the womb. Now, the Bible, we're basing everything on the Bible, it clearly does speak about the unborn in later stages of pregnancy being a person. Luke 1:41 through 44 depicts an unborn child in the 6th month being conscious and showing agency. I think we can safely say at that point that unborn child at the 6-month mark is a person. But again, not too many people are going to argue about that. So for this discussion, I'm going to assume that the unborn person is a person by the 3rd trimester. But are they a person any sooner than that? So let's start by talking about the issue of viability outside the womb and whether or not that is necessary for personhood. As I said earlier, the Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey recognize the difficulty of identifying exactly when a person becomes a person. When does personhood begin? They agreed, though, by the 3rd trimester, the unborn seemed to be a person, and thus abortion would only be allowed in the 3rd trimester when it was medically necessary. Casey specifically tied that ruling to the idea that by the 3rd trimester, the baby is viable. That could be potentially survive outside the womb. Most of the pro-choice advocates that I've heard discuss abortion also recognize that the unborn is a person once they're viable. However, they typically are make viability then a qualification for being a person. I have a problem with that reasoning. First of all, babies have been born and survived prior to the 3rd trimester. The 3rd trimester doesn't begin until 28 weeks. Curtis Zy Keith Means was born at 21 weeks and a day of pregnancy. Imogene Stonehouse was born after 22 weeks of pregnancy. So we're showing that viability actually is potentially much earlier than several weeks earlier, even months earlier than that 28-week mark. And with advances in medical technology, we may still see babies surviving birth even earlier. So I don't think that we can say that the viability starts at that 28 mark. even if we are going to tie viability to personhood. But I also don't see any rational reason to make personhood contingent upon being viable outside the womb. Because even after a full-term pregnancy, a newborn is far from being self-sufficient, and it won't be for many years. And it's still really dependent on others for its care once it leaves the womb. And I don't really think that I don't see the connection there. And so while it's hard to deny the personhood of a fetus that is viable outside the womb, I don't think that viability is determined by that that I don't think that viability determines personhood. I think that you can be non-viable outside the womb and still be a person. So then, does personhood begin at conception? And this is where I really want to focus a little bit of time today, because most modern evangelicals in America insist that the moment the sperm and egg meet, an individual person exists. However, as I explained in previous videos in the series, few Christians really held this position before the religious right turned abortion into a partisan political issue and launched a propaganda campaign to persuade evangelicals to oppose abortion. And that really shaped evangelical thinking to rally around this idea of personhood from conception. Nowhere in scriptures does it explicitly state that personhood begins at conception. The closest it does come is in passages such as Psalms 139:13 and following. For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you. When I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. In my last video, I looked at this in specific verses. I chose to focus on this one because it specifically references the unformed substance, which could accurately be translated embryo. These passages figuratively describe God's work and guiding the unborn's development in the womb. And I know scientists typically understand fetal development as a natural biological process, but as a Christian and a theist, I believe God is active in all natural processes, including in forming the unborn in the womb. And the language here beautifully compares this work to an artisan crafting a masterpiece. And I think that, yes, God is at work in fashioning a baby outside the womb. But does that mean that from the moment he begins that work, that baby is a person? So let's take this analogy of God artistically forming the baby in the womb, and let's take it further. Let's focus on, there are a lot of different types of artists, but let's focus on a potter, since the Bible frequently compares God's work in creating us to the work of a potter. Now, when a potter puts a lump of clay on his wheel with the intention of fashioning that lump of clay into a pot, is that lump of clay a pot as soon as it touches the wheel? I would say it obviously isn't. But I would also argue that that lump of clay becomes a pot before the potter completes the process of molding that pot. As the clay takes shape in the potter's hands, it starts to take on the characteristics of a pot, and it does become a pot at some point as it's being fashioned. Now, it might be really hard to say at what precise point the transition between just a lump of clay and a pot takes place, but that moment must occur. However, it's hard to argue that that lump lump of clay becomes a pot just because it's on the wheel with the intention of being shaped into a pot. And so The challenge before us is in deciding when personhood begins for the unborn. But there are a lot of problems with saying what that precise point is. But I think it's hard to argue that it is at conception. Just like I think it's hard to say that that initial lump of clay is a pot. You know, as I said, that there is no point in Scripture where it specifically says that personhood begins at conception. There is one verse of Scripture that I don't really hear people bring into the abortion debate very often, but it might point to and seems to suggest that there is a distinction between conception and the later thing that it develops. In James 1:14 through 15, he says, "But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." James here is talking about where the impulse to commit evil comes from. Where do we get that impulse of sin? In the previous verses, he denies that it comes from God. And here he's saying that it originates with our own desires. And he explained that that desire is conceived in us, but then that desire gives birth to sin. The sin will, that sin therefore will then grow and bring forth, become the parent itself of death. So we see this process. Desire is conceived, it develops into a full-blown sin, and that sin becomes the parent of death. Now, why I think this verse is relevant for our current discussion is it makes a distinction between what is conceived, in this case desire, and what is born, death. Now, I don't think that we can argue that desire and sin are one and the same. I think that that when we latch onto and start holding on to that desire, that this it becomes sin in our heart. And, Jesus implies that, makes that clear in the Sermon on the Mount. But just that initial desire is not the sin. And while this passage is using some figurative languages, it would suggest that what is conceived is related to, but is different in nature to what is born. The conceived desire becomes sin in its development. If we apply this to human conception, it implies that the embryo isn't a person. It becomes a person. Now, current pro-life advocates point to the existence of distinct biological life as evidence of personhood from conception. They accurately point out that we have a greater understanding of the biological process of fetal development than the ancient world did in which the Bible is written. Actually, when we talk about this, which is important for our discussion, in the ancient world, semen was considered seed from the man. Our English word sperm actually comes from the Greek word sperma, which means seed. The womb was therefore viewed as like the soil in which the seed is planted. There wasn't any understanding of a woman having an egg. It's a microscopic thing. They didn't have a way of seeing, so they didn't understand the egg. So the womb was just viewed as soil in which the man's seed was planted. But most considered the unborn as a part of the woman's body until some point in fetal development. And in some cases, there were people who didn't believe that it was separate from the woman's body until that infant separated from the woman's body and became and was born. Now, anti-abortion advocates point out that modern medical science has taught us that from conception there is a distinct biological life. And it has its own DNA structure, and they put a lot of emphasis on that to make their argument. They like to talk about life beginning at conception. They don't like to talk about personhood. They kind of scoff at the philosophical distinction between life and personhood. It's life, yes, it is living tissue, but is it a genuine person? And by dismissing this distinction between life and personhood, the existence of living cells constitutes proof of their position that life begins at that personhood begins at conception. And then they point out that the unique genetic code demonstrates that the embryo is distinct from the mother, not a part of the woman's body. And that sounds, if you don't really think too hard about it, it sounds very convincing. But if medical science has so clearly settled the issue of when personhood begins, why hasn't the medical community led the charge against abortion? Now, I know it's really popular in some segments of our society to impugn the motives and integrity of medical professionals. And evangelicals often gravitate towards those segments. So they may, they would say, oh, yeah, doctors just don't care about life. But think about your own doctor. Is this a morally corrupt person that you're seeing and trusting your health in? What about your children's pediatrician? Do you really think that pediatrician is morally corrupt and doesn't care about innocent human life? Why do you trust your child's health to them then? Most likely you realize that they are good people. Medical professionals have dedicated their lives to saving other lives. And they have a very strict code of ethics that governs them, that goes back many years. If there really was medical evidence for personhood from conception, and that evidence was really strong, I'm confident we would see a lot more doctors and nurses speaking out against abortion than we do. I know there are some, but the medical community as a whole understands the process of fetal development early enough to say that, at conception, it's just not a person yet. Let's talk about the medical reality of what conception is. While the word sperm does mean seed phonetically, biologically, it really isn't analogous to seed at all. Sperm is actually more similar to pollen, which originates from the stamen of a flower, which is the male part of a flower, and then it fertilizes ovules and another flower's pestle being the female part. And once the pollen fertilizes those ovules become seeds. The ovules would be analogous to the female's egg, and therefore we can think of an embryo as the seed of a person. An embryo isn't a person any more than an acorn is an oak tree. It has the potential of becoming a person, but it just isn't one. And I think we could point then to further evidence that this person personhood doesn't start at conception just by the odds of an embryo ever being born to begin with. Once that egg is fertilized, and we have an embryo in the womb, that embryo only has a 20 to 50% chance of implanting on the uterine wall. It will most likely pass straight through the woman's body. It won't implant. Won't implant in the wall, and will be expelled during her next menstrual cycle. Even if that embryo does implant, there's an additional 10 to 15% chance of a miscarriage. And 80% of those miscarriages occur during the first trimester, which that embryo is still in that embryo phase. Now, so what's the point of that? It means that God created a system for reproduction that doesn't favor the embryo. Most embryos will never be born, regardless of whether a woman seeks abortion or not. Honestly, most embryos will die before the woman ever knew that it was the mother ever knew it was created. When you think about that, it seems that anti-abortion evangelicals put more value on an embryo than God does. And I believe this suggests that God doesn't have a system that that has a higher percentage chance of the embryo surviving because he doesn't recognize the embryo as a person. I may be wrong about that, but it does seem to me that it's hard to say that if an embryo is a full person, God would allow most of them to perish so early on. So let's talk about the whole issue of personhood. As I said earlier, anti-abortion activists don't like to just don't want to talk about personhood. They just want to talk about biological life. But if we really want to talk about this issue honestly, we have to make a distinction between biological life and personhood. And it's very difficult to define medically, and more important to our discussion, theologically, what constitutes a person. The Bible treats human beings as having special value because we're created in God's image. But defining what it is about humanity that makes us unique and therefore bearers of the image of God, theologians have really debated that for centuries, even outside the abortion debate. And so most theologians look at some quality that makes God's image such, in us, that makes us God's image. They look at reason, intelligence, emotions, the ability to communicate with God, self-awareness, free will, etc., and things like that. And it's hard to narrow it down. Honestly, I think it's probably not a single thing, but it's a complex combination of these type of factors. But theologian Michael Heiser, who I love greatly, who's been very influential on me, Heiser explains the implications of how we define the image of God for the abortion debate. According to Heiser, if being the image of God is any of the qualities that I just listed above, and I quote, Bible believers ought to abandon the idea of the sanctity of life in the womb. He will then go on to say, the pro-life position is based on the proposition that human life, and so personhood, begins at conception. The simple-celled zygote inside the woman's womb, which pro-lifers believe to be a human person, is not as self-aware. It has no intelligence, rational thought processes, or emotions. It cannot speak or communicate. It cannot commune with God or pray. It cannot exercise its will or respond to the conscience. If you want to argue that those things are they're potentially, then that means that you have only a potential person. That's actually the pro-choice position. Potential personhood is not actual personhood. This thought process would mean that abortion is not killing until personhood is achieved. So here, Heiser recognizes the inconsistency in the pro-life thought with the common conceptions that Christians have on the person of God, or the image of God in man, and therefore humanity itself. Now, Heiser responds by redefining the image of God as a status that humans have rather than any quality or combination of qualities. Now, as I said when I introduced this quote, I have tremendous love and respect for Michael Heiser. God bless his soul. We lost him a couple of years ago, and I think it's a great loss to the church. But when I just deconstructed my faith, no person really contributed more to helping me reconstruct my beliefs and my faith than Heiser did. I probably wouldn't be in a place to do this ministry if a friend hadn't introduced me to Heiser's writing. That being said, I believe his solution on this issue falls flat. Heiser recognizes the fatal flaw in the anti-abortion argument and attempts to sidestep it. Heiser didn't consider altering his view on abortion in light of the flaw to the anti-abortion argument for Christians. He sits there and says, okay, well, we must have misunderstood what it means to be the image of God. I think it's very hard to identify any specific characteristics that make us the image of God, but I think that we have to say that there are some characteristics that are associated with being the image of God. And when you look at the embryo, specifically in the zygote phase, there's nothing there that can reasonably be considered a person. And furthermore, redefining image of God, as Heiser does, doesn't fix a problem because personhood, theologically, extends beyond humanity. We are created in the image of God, but God himself is a person. The doctrine of the Trinity is that God is a single essence, and he exists in three eternally distinct persons. Now, while person can be difficult to find theologically, at the very least, it has the idea of a distinct personal identity. And that is key and fundamental to understanding personhood, a distinct personal identity. The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit exist distinct from one another that allows them to have interpersonal relationships with one another. And so as a distinct identity, a person can't be split into two. As a person, I can't divide into two persons. That would be a ridiculous idea. Again, in the history of theology, the Nestorians were declared heretics for putting such a distinction between the humanity and deity of Jesus that they failed to respect the unity of his personhood, and where they were accused of, in effect, dividing him into two persons, and therefore expelled from the Christian community. So, without a clear, distinct personal identity, you don't have a person. A zygote, however, can be divided. In fact, it does divide naturally. Identical twins arise when the embryo splits into two distinct embryos that are genetically identical but grow into two distinct persons. This means that the zygote doesn't yet have an individual identity, and therefore it cannot be a person. The reality of identical twins therefore eliminates the possibility that personhood begins at conception. So, when I say that I don't think that we can say that the unborn isn't a person until it reaches viability, the third trimester, I also don't believe that you can say that it is a person at conception. That means at some point between conception and the third trimester, that unborn becomes a person. So when I realized the evidence to support, we didn't have the evidence to support personhood beginning at conception. I'm not buying that we have to have viability outside the womb. I have to figure out where in that 28 weeks between conception and the third trimester, when does the unborn become a person? That's the difficult challenge. So I went back and started studying books, not things written by either pro-choice or anti-abortion advocates, but started reading things presented by actual medical journals and medical sources, credible medical sources, about stages of fetal development to consider what the Bible is really teaching about personhood. And try to figure out when that embryo becomes a baby, a human person. A strong case can be made for personhood beginning at the end of the embryo stage. As I pointed out in my last video, the Septuagint translates Exodus 21:22 and following in a way that doesn't recognize the rights of the unborn as having full human status when it is unformed. But once the unborn becomes formed, it is recognized with full personhood, again, according to the Greek translation the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew text. This is a really bizarre translation. It does offer ambiguity or clarify some really ambiguous phrasing in the original Hebrew. But, it's a questionable if that's what the original Hebrew meant. But it demonstrates that by the time of the New Testament, this distinction was in the mind of Jews. It also influenced early Christians like Augustine, most notably, who didn't view an abortion as a murder until you have a formed fetus. Now, we don't really, in our modern context, really use the terminology of formed versus unformed. We still, though, use the equivalent, which is embryo versus fetus. And embryo and fetus really correspond with that idea of formed versus unformed. At the 9th week of pregnancy, an embryo does transform into a fetus. At this point, the unborn takes on the physical characteristics that make it identifiable as a human. A human embryo at the is really indistinguishable from the embryo of animals. I'm going to pull up a slide here, picture, and see here. When you look at this picture, there are 3 embryos. One of those embryos is human. One is a dolphin, and the third is a pig. Can you tell which is which? Yeah, I doubt. It's actually the one in the top left corner. But when you look at a 9-week-old fetus, here it is clearly human. The features still aren't clear. There's still some development that needs to take place. But you obviously have here at this stage a what is identifiable as a human being. That is the transition between the formed and the unformed embryo. Now, I've heard anti-abortion advocates argue that the unborn looks exactly like a human is supposed to look at this stage of at that stage of development. But I do think it's significant, and we should take into account that the unborn isn't visibly recognizable until that point. And that transition to being visibly recognizable is significant. Going back to that analogy I mentioned earlier about when does that lump of clay become a pot in the hands of the potter, we could reasonably argue it's when we can identify his work as a pot. I have a fascination with art. I have some artistic skills. I'm not a professional artist, but I just always liked the art process. But I really like to watch videos on YouTube where you watch artists make something. And these videos, they usually don't tell you what they're going to make at first, and you just see them splashing paint or carving something out of some things. And you see it come together in this beautiful art. But part of the joy is in watching that transition from these really indecipherable shapes, until it takes a form where you say, "Oh, it's a," and whatever it is. But that moment when you're like, "Oh, I see what he's making now, or she's making now." Seeing God at work in shaping something in a womb. That moment when you realize, "Oh, that's a human." That is a significant step. I don't think that that transition alone can be the deciding factor when the unborn becomes a person, but we should consider it along with other factors. Another thing to consider, and that a lot of people put emphasis on through church history, is fetal movement. This has been the most common belief throughout church history on when the unborn becomes a person. They referred to it as quickening. when the mother can feel the fetus moving inside her. This typically happens around 16 to 20 weeks. You know, the unborn's ability to move was understood as therefore having a will and volition. However, putting such an emphasis on quickening, which again doesn't happen until 16 or 20 weeks, it's largely tied to the limited knowledge of what was going on in the womb. They didn't have sonograms, so they really wouldn't know a lot about the status of what was going on. They noticed that menstruation stops, then they start noticing the woman showing her abdomen swelling, and then you would have quickening, and then birth. But that quickening was is a major step when you don't have the ability to look inside the womb to see what's going on. However, movement actually occurs now that we have sonograms. We realize that movement occurs much earlier than the woman's ability to feel it, and that actually movement starts around that 9-week mark. That moment when the embryo transitions into a fetus. This then adds to the evidence that personhood begins around that 9th week. But I think that a major factor in determining personhood is whether the unborn is a conscious being. Anti-abortion activists like to emphasize the beating heart, which typically happens around 6 weeks. And pro-choice activists, on the other hand, is going to argue that that's technically not a heartbeat. And when I was looking into this issue and trying to decide whether or not that signal that they pick up is really a heartbeat or it's a proto-heart, whether or not it really actually functions, I became concerned about another question. What about the mind? Well, it's hard to precisely nail down what makes humans the image of God. As I said earlier, most of the qualities that theologians have pointed to are mental faculties. We are our minds. So can we really consider anyone without a mind a person? And we have life support systems that can keep a human heart beating even after what is called brain death. But medically, doctors consider them dead if they're brain dead. If there is no longer brain function, machines can keep your heart and your heart beating, your lungs breathing, but without the brain, you're dead. So, while someone emphasizes the embryo has a heartbeat, we might be asking where there's a brain. Unfortunately, when I started looking into this was the brain development issue becomes as complex as the rest of the issue. As early as 5 weeks, there's a neural tube that develops, which will later become the brain and spinal cord. Now, that's the beginnings of a brain, but it's hard to argue that that's really a functioning brain with a mind. There's starts of a neural activity, but is that little bundle of nerves really a brain? So when does the brain fully develop? Unfortunately, it's when we're around 25 years old. So we can't make full brain development a qualification for personhood, because then we say no one's a person until they're around 25 years old. However, by the end of the first trimester, around 12 to 13 weeks, the basic structure of the brain is fully formed. Starting around the 15th week, there is really rapid brain development. And by 16 weeks, there is evidence of the unborn fetus responding to sound, specifically the voices of his parents. And I think that demonstrates that the baby is conscious by that 15th to 16th week. And therefore, I would say clearly a person at this stage. So while I'm not a doctor or a biologist, my research makes me confident that between that 12th and 15th week of development, the brain is functioning to the level where we consider it as having a conscious mind. However, theologically, the mind is more than a brain. The mind is a harmonious duet of the non material spirit and the physical brain. Unfortunately, the Bible doesn't make it clear where we get our spirits from. It makes it clear that we have a spirit, and there are many references to it. Death is associated with the spirit, uh, you know, um, giving up the spirit in places, but the origin of the spirit is not as clear as we would like it to. And there is within Christian theology two primary theories about the origin of the spirit. One is the what's called the traducian theory, and this is the belief that our spirit is a blend of the mother and the father spirits, just as our body is a blending of the mother and the father's physical being. Now, this theory would tend to favor the spirit being present at conception, but we don't know that God doesn't take time to form a new spirit, just as He takes time to form the body. But it is. But the tradition view is not as popular as the creation view. And this is the idea that God creates a new spirit and puts it into the body. Now, the point which that happens could really be any point in the fetal development, that God could create a soul spirit and put it inside the body of the unborn. That could happen at conception. It could happen moments before birth, hypothetically. Unfortunately, the Bible doesn't just give us enough information about where the soul or spirit originates to draw any inferences about what stage of development the unborn receives a soul. Not directly, at least. But let's talk about another factor. We've talked about heartbeats. We've talked about brain activity. There's another key aspect of what makes someone a living person versus being dead, and that's breath. So let's talk about the Bible's view of breath. So while we can't say with any certainty that a baby gets, when the baby gets a spirit, in both Hebrew and Greek, the same word conveys the idea of spirit. That word can also be translated wind and breath. And the Bible, throughout the entire text, ties breath and life together. When talk about they breathed their last, they gave up their breath, they gave up their spirit. Now, one particularly important verse that speaks more clearly on that than anything else, and may be the verse that most clearly says something about when personhood begins, and that's the creation of the first man. Genesis 2:7 says, "Then the Lord formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature." God formed Adam from the earth, but he was an inanimate object until God gave him breath. At that point, he became a living creature. Now, the phrase living creature, hey nefesh, is likely as close as we'll come to having a parallel to the idea of personhood, as we've been using it in this issue. The Brown Driver Briggs lexicon, which is one of the foundational Hebrew lexicons, translate nefesh as soul, living being, life, self, or person. So here we have the inanimate body becoming a living creature, becoming a person upon receiving breath. Now, there's almost definitely some degree of figurative language here, but it's undeniable that God formed a body like a potter forms a clay, but that body became a living soul upon receiving breath. Is it really a stretch then to point to something like Psalms 139:13, where God forms a body in a womb and conclude then that that body became a living soul when God gives that baby the breath of life? Now, before you jump to the conclusion that that would imply that the unborn isn't a person until the baby takes its first breath, in which that would be birth, remember, respiration actually begins inside the womb, actually around 10 to 11 weeks. The fetus begins to inhale and exhale amniotic fluid. But as you can see, there are really a lot of factors that we have to consider when it comes to determining when personhood begins. And I'm not the one to make the final pronouncement on this issue. But when I look at the evidence, I'm practically certain that that personhood doesn't begin at conception. I mean, I used to believe that, but really look at the evidence, I don't think that there's any reason to say that. I don't really think that there's a strong argument to be made for an embryo being a person. But by the 9th to 11th week, the unborn has become a formed fetus. It has begun to breathe. And the Bible connects being a living person with breath. And so I'm inclined to believe personhood likely begins around that 9 to 11 week period. I'm confident, however, that a fetus is a person by the 15th week, since by this point the fetus starts responding to voices indicating some level of consciousness. So let's then talk about what that means for the ethics of abortion. Again, based on my research, I'm confident that an embryo prior to 9 weeks of pregnancy is not a person. Therefore, aborting that embryo isn't murder. I'm not sure any abortion after the first, in that first trimester, that first 13 weeks is murder. But I'm confident that it's not murder in those first 9 weeks. And according to the Center of Disease Control, 93% of abortions occur in that first trimester, and 79% occur in those first 9 weeks, when it seems like personhood hasn't begun. Therefore, the vast majority of abortions aren't killing a baby. I'd also point out that the later abortions tend to be medically necessary. So based on that, I would oppose any law that would restrict a woman's ability to access an abortion in the first 9 weeks, and probably wouldn't support a law that restricted it in the first 15 weeks. At what point I'm confident by that 15 weeks that you are dealing with a person in the womb. That doesn't mean, just because it's not abortion isn't murder, though, that there aren't moral consequences to an abortion. God is at work in forming a new person in the womb, and that is a sacred work. And so even though the embryo might not be a person, it is still precious and valuable. I'm never going to forget when my wife and I had our first prenatal appointment, and they put the little sonogram machine on her abdomen, and we saw the indiscernible shape of what would be our daughter. We could see that little flash of her heart beating. And, both of us, just broke down, just hugging each other with tears rolling down our face about seeing that precious thing that was going on. And she's now about to turn 12 and, turning into a young lady, but we watched her grow. But that first sight of her in the womb, it was powerful. And I think that the embryo, while not a person, is precious and valuable at some level. And so I don't think that God working and forming the womb, that special work, should be interrupted casually. And so an abortion shouldn't be the primary means for birth control. Now, honestly, I don't think this applies to most women who get abortions. In my experience, women who seek abortions are in really desperate situations, and they're really making a difficult decision under their difficult circumstances. So I would say, though, that as a general rule, I'm inclined to believe that even in the earlier stages, most of the time abortion is a sin. I do think, though, that there are exceptions to that. In Jesus' ministry, healing the sick took precedence over keeping the Sabbath, protecting spies, justified Rahab's lie, and feeding David and his men was more important than reserving the sacred bread for the priests. There are times that things that are typically morally wrong are justifiable under the circumstances. And I think that there are times when an abortion would be considered justifiable. When the woman's life is at risk, I would say not only justifiable, I would say it's advisable. Yes, go ahead and have the abortion. When there are other health risks to the woman, or in cases where the fetus isn't going to be viable, or other serious defects of the fetus, and that issue, I think the woman should have to prayerfully make the best decision she can with the advisement of her doctor, her husband or life partner if she has one, and maybe other people she trusts. She takes their advisement and she makes the best decision she can. And there's so many complexities there, it's hard for me to make a hard and fast rule on that. And I don't think that our laws can make a hard and fast rule on that. In cases of rape and incest, that woman has already endured violations from one man, and I'm certainly not going to compound that by telling her what she should do. When a woman is really so impoverished and finds herself pregnant, and having that baby means she might not be able to feed not only that baby, but the other children she already has, she has to make a decision. And I'm not going to say in any of these situations that abortion is the best decision other than the life of the woman. But under these circumstances, I will say that I'm not going to judge the woman for making the decision she makes either. She'll have to make the best decision she can and trust the mercy of a loving God if she makes the wrong one. I'm going to show her mercy as well. I can't know all of her circumstances thoroughly enough to say with any certainty what she should or shouldn't do. But I would say if a woman is going to get an abortion, she should do so as early in pregnancy as possible, because we want to get it, that it would be best to end that before the embryo becomes a person. Unfortunately, since the Dobbs decisions, many states have made it really difficult to get an abortion. I live in Texas, which likely has the most restrictive abortion laws in the country. So I get it. I think the unintended consequences of these anti-abortion laws is going to be that even though they intended to protect innocent lives, they may make it harder for women to get that quick access to abortion. And by the time they make arrangements to leave their state and the other considerations that's going to be that are necessary in order to get access to an abortion, they're delaying getting that procedure, and they may be pushing it into the second trimester. At which point, I think that you can fairly consider that to be a living person. So, in addition to women dying from pregnancy complications, that these new abortion laws have presented, I think they're also going to result in actually more abortions happening after the fetus becomes a person, and therefore result in more babies being killed, instead of ensuring access to early abortion, where they could have killed an embryo who has not yet become a person. So I think that these abortion laws are going to result in more lives being lost rather than saving lives. If you really want to limit the number of abortions, the answer I don't think is legislation. I think that uh, these things that are attempted to restrict women's access to the abortion, especially when you're trying to threaten her or her doctor with prison penalties, I don't think that's going to really help the situation at all. If you really want to reduce abortions, take measures that reduce unwanted pregnancy and offer assistance to those who are struggling to support a child. Support programs like parental leave, WIC, free or affordable child care, so women can afford to raise their children rather than being pushed towards choosing an abortion for financial reasons. Make comprehensive sex education a part of school so people know how to avoid unwanted pregnancies. Have a universal healthcare system that covers contraception and also gives women a way to take care of her baby's health after that baby's born. That, I think, is a better solution to the problem. Now, I do want to reiterate that I don't think I have all the answers on this really complex issue, but the perspective I shared in this video is based on really years of study and careful reflection in search of the truth. I know that there are many who are going to consider me way too lenient on abortion, while others are going to think that I don't respect choice enough. But I'm not here to advance either agenda. I'm trying to provoke thoughtful reflection that reflects and respects the complexity of this issue in a way that will be consistent with biblical teaching and sound theology. I want Christians to show empathy for women who find themselves in challenging situations, but I also want them to have an appropriate level of respect for the unborn. Unfortunately, there are a lot of Christians who will come to this issue and they're going to let their emotions drown out reasoning. They'll let this issue drive them into a blind rage that politicians can manipulate. They'll hold up these politicians as servants of God, no matter how ungodly their policies are, so long as those politicians pretend like they care about the unborn. But I'm not that kind of Christian.